wait for this. All right, welcome everybody for our afternoon session. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce Mathew Simpson from the University of Cambridge, who will speak to us about Should Expressivists Go Global?
Thank you. Thanks very much everyone for coming and for the invitation. At some point I will get fed up of standing and I will sit on this table, but I think I'll still be visible to the Zoom audience. They won't be missing out. Okay, so my talk is about some very, very big picture issues in expressivism, in meta-ethics, but also in other areas. So as probably many of you know, Hugh Price has defended this kind of big idea, which he's become very well known for, which is that so-called local expressivism ends up collapsing into global expressivism, which is a view that Price is very well known for defending. And this is very philosophically significant for various reasons. For some people, this is a very exciting idea, and for other people, it's just a reductio of everything that's going on. Because if local expressivism can't remain local, then it was never any good. Price has defended various approaches to this, but his kind of core two arguments for this come in a couple of papers of his, which he calls the external and internal arguments. The external arguments try to apply pressure from non-expressivist views that the expressivist tends to accept to push them towards global expressivism. The internal argument tries to use things that expressivists, by their very nature of their theories, have to accept to push them towards global expressivism. So what I'm going to do in this talk is just explain what's going on in the debate to start with. That's kind of half the battle in this case, actually, is to make clear sense of what the views are. And I'm then going to show why Price's arguments just very clearly fail when they're targeted at actual local expressivists like Blackburn and Gibbard. I'll also show as I go that Price has a very easy way of fixing his arguments, i.e. making the premises true, but if he does that, they just don't apply to the local expressivists as they're actually the actual real life expressivists. And that's going to kind of feed into the conclusion I'm going to draw at the end, which is there's actually no substantial difference between Price's global expressivism and someone like Blackburn's local expressivism, which is a view that I've defended before. So here I'm coming at this from a kind of bottom-up approach where I look at Price's arguments and what they're indicating. Okay, so just to start with, I want to define expressivism. And this is a very, very rough definition, but it's out there in the literature. I've very egotistically cited myself here, but there's tons of other places that this sort of view is defined. So where we have some discourse X, whether it be moral or modal, probabilistic thought and talk or something else, expressivism is committed at least to saying that we can explain why those terms and thoughts mean what they do or get used as they do without appealing to what I'm going to call representational concepts. So this claim is obviously very general and very vague, but I think it captures what we're after for this debate. So think about a moral expressivist. A moral expressivist is someone who thinks that we can understand how moral thoughts work and what it is to have a thought which we could describe as a thought that something is good or something is bad. Or what it is to say that something is good or bad or right or wrong. We can do all of that without saying that these thoughts or sentences are describing or representing or picturing some fact or property or anything like that. The expressivist then goes on to give a more specific positive story as well about the nature of these thoughts and sentences, but the core claim that I'm interested in this is this negative one, that we can understand how these terms and thoughts work without saying that they represent, that they describe, that they have truth conditions, and so on. That doesn't mean that they deny that these things do that. So this is a kind of crucial move over the last 3 decades or so, as expressivists have stopped saying, oh, these things don't represent. Instead, then tend to be more careful now and say, I can say how they work without saying that they do represent. That's not the same as saying that they don't represent at all. So expressivism is a view according to which we could say why a term has the meaning it does, or gets used as it does, or why a thought has the content that it does, without appealing to these so-called representational concepts. Now, I just use that term representational concepts as a kind of catch-all, and it's actually really hard to see in the literature what exactly people are talking about when they talk about these things. So there are at least 4 different options out there. One is a list, usually borrowed from Robert Kraut, has a big list of these things. These are things like truth conditions, truth, description, belief, reference, fact, predication, representation, obviously. Other people argue that there's a kind of family here, so it's not just a list, but it's a family of concepts that are tied together by definitions. So you see the idea that if a thought represents the world as being such that P, then it also describes the world as being such that P, and there's no particular gap between doing those two things. Or if a sentence has truth conditions, if it's true if and only if P is on P, then it can also express a belief that P. So we have this idea of a family tied together by definitions. A third approach here is what I call subject matter. So thinking of representational concepts as relations between terms and thoughts and things in the world that are putatively the subject matter of those things. So reference would be a really obvious example of a subject matter relation, but there could be more than just that. And finally, the generality conception. And this is what I think has been relatively neglected when understanding what's going on here, which is that Price favors this approach. Generality, Price takes representational concepts to be those that would be capable of explaining a wide range of terms or concepts. So predicate reference would be a representational concept there, because if it were capable of explaining things, it would likely be able to explain all kinds of predicates. And Price thinks that we should target these representational concepts. Later, I'm going to bring out that point and show that that's how Price could fix his arguments. Okay, so expressivism about a discourse or a kind of term of thought X says that we can explain what's going on with these things without appealing to any of those concepts that we just talked about. And then global expressivism says that we can do that for all terms and thoughts, and local expressivism says we can, only for some. Okay, so Price thinks that this view is unstable, and he uses these internal and external arguments to do so. So the external argument appeals to minimalism about the concepts that get mentioned in that expressivist thesis. So here's the argument set out with these 2 premises. So the first premise is just that minimalism about all representational concepts entails that all terms and thoughts can be explained without them. And Price takes this as definitional. This is just what minimalism is. He actually defines minimalism as the view that the relevant concept has no role to play in explaining how thought and language works. So if you're a minimalist about reference, you're someone who thinks that we never need to appeal to reference to explain how terms and thoughts work. How that particular commitment is located with regard to the other things that we know minimalists say is a tricky question, and it's kind of irrelevant for Price, because at least he's taken the defining commitment of minimalism to be a denial of explanatory role. So for him, E1 is just definitionally true. If you are a minimalist about all representational concepts, then you think that none of those concepts can explain anything with regard to the meaning of terms and thoughts. However, he then thinks that local expressivists are actually committed to minimalism about all representational concepts. And it follows from those 2 claims that local expressivists are actually committed to global expressivism, because they're committed to the idea that all terms and thoughts can be explained without these concepts. So this argument only has one substantial step. E1 is true by definition, and it would be kind of pointless to deny that, because Price could just do without the word minimalism. So instead, we've got to look at premise 2, and I think that's where this argument is going to go wrong. So why should we think that local expressivists are committed to minimalism about all of these concepts? Well, one idea is to appeal to the family view of representational concepts and say, well, these things are all tied together by definition. So to be a minimalist about one is going to entail minimalism about all the others in this family. So it seems hard to say that I'm a minimalist about description and count everything that is a description and only things that are a description as a representation, but not be a minimalist about representation. That seems like a weird thing to say. So we have this idea that's out there in the literature that minimalism suddenly kind of sweeps over this whole bunch of concepts. And this is often known as the problem of creeping minimalism in a very slightly different context to the one we're in now. But I think this is just far too quick. So just because minimalism might cover things like representation, description, reference, that kind of thing, doesn't mean it's going to cover every single concept the expressivist might want to draw a distinction in terms of here. So one example that's often used in the literature is causal tracking. So we have this idea that some terms or thoughts have as their role the tracking of things in the environment. So just as a thermometer tracks the ambient temperature, a term, maybe a tree or something like that, is meant to track the presence of trees in our environment. Now, obviously, no term tracks things in the world like a thermometer tracks temperature, because it's far, far more complicated than that. But that's the key idea, is that some concepts or terms do this, and this kind of naturalist story about how these concepts work. But think about that concept of causal tracking. Well, nobody is going to be committed to minimalism about that. Certainly not the expressivist, because there's no reason to think that that concept couldn't help explain how any terms or thoughts work. That's what minimalism is, according to Price. So it would be very strange for an expressivist to say, well, I'm a minimalist about causal tracking because I think that the fact that a term is used, the fact that a term's uses are caused by the presence of trees can't help explain why those terms get used as they do. Because it's kind of built into tracking that it will help explain why those terms get used as they do. So we just have a straightforward counterexample to Price's claim. Expressivists aren't committed to minimalism about all of these concepts. No, also, actually, there's really just no reason to believe E2 in general. Price doesn't actually give any specific reason to think that minimalism is going to sweep over everything. He usually just says local expressivists are committed to semantic minimalism, which is the view that these concepts don't help explain anything, but he doesn't really tend to go into detail about which concepts that actually means and why. So even if the expressivist accepts quite a lot of minimalisms about reference, description, fact, belief, representation, in order to make sense of the fact that in ordinary use, we talk of moral facts and moral descriptions and that kind of thing, there's just no reason to think that they're going to be minimalist about literally every concept that they might want to use to explain some terms, but not moral ones. Now, there's a possible reply here, which is just to exclude tracking from this area and just say, well, it's not really a representational concept. And Price, I think, is interested in that idea because he thinks that this concept isn't general enough. Causal tracking isn't something that plausibly is going to explain all terms' meanings or all predicates' meanings, because they're going to be singular terms, they're going to be predicates whose job isn't to track features of the natural environment. And expressivists, local expressivists, are going to agree with that because they think moral terms don't do this. And so it seems hard to say that tracking is something that's as general as something like predicate reference. And if we say that, then we can say, well, okay, causal tracking isn't actually a representational concept, and my point stands. And Price here might appeal to the idea that actually, given these definitions that link things like description, belief, representation, we can see that minimalism is going to sweep across a whole family of kind of high-level, big picture, semantic and psychological concepts like belief and reference and representation. Now, that's fine. It just now destabilizes the argument. Because now E2 has become true, because tracking is no longer in the scope of representational concepts. But now E3 doesn't follow, because what global expressivism means in E3 is not the thing that the local expressivists are rejecting. Why is that? Because local expressivists don't accept Price's view of what representational concepts are. They never have. Blackburn and Gebhard have always counted things like causal tracking, those kinds of spatial or causal relations between speakers and things, they've always counted those as relevant to this debate as part of what I'm calling representational concepts. So they can listen to Price's new argument and just say, yeah, I agree, E1 is true, and I agree E2 is true, but E3 is false because the thing that you're saying I now accept is not global expressivism, it's still local expressivism. So Price has a way out of this argument, but it's just going to destabilize the whole thing. Okay. There's a lot more to say about that, but I want to move on to talk about the internal arguments. This gets really interesting. So the headline of this argument is that basically the success of moral expressivism, which obviously all moral expressivists are committed to, that success is sort of too good. It's, your theory becomes so successful that it ends up spreading to all areas. So this is putting a lot of pressure on the expressivists because it's basically asking them to either agree that global expressivism is true or admit that their theory was bad from the beginning, which isn't a great position to be in if you're a local expressivist. And this is specifically targeted at moral expressivists. I don't think it has to be. I think it's just convenient for Price because moral expressivism is the most developed form of expressivism out there. And the primary examples of local expressivists involved in this debate are moral expressivists like Blackburn and Gillard. So again, we have a quite simple structure for this argument. The premises go like this. I1, if moral expressivism is true, we can explain moral language and thought without using representational concepts. Well, that's true by definition, because that's just what expressivism says. That we can say how moral language and thought works without saying that it represents, describes, blah, blah, blah. Then the key premise is I2. If we can do that, if we can explain moral language and thought without using representational concepts, then we can do the same thing for all language and thought without using representational concepts. So it's obviously here is where all the philosophical action is. It's somehow going to extend this explanation everywhere. And the conclusion is, of course, that moral expressivism guarantees global expressivism. Because if it works, it has this good explanation, which then generalizes to everything. So global expressivism is true. But why think that the key premise here, I2, is actually true at all? And Price thinks it's about the nature of the expressivist explanation of moral language and thought. So the idea that he has goes something like this. When the moral expressivist comes to explain moral language, they will, quote, offer some function or point for the practice of expressing moral judgments, say, in declarative form, and ascribing truth and falsity to the resulting claims. So the idea is that if you ask Blackburn or Gillard, why do we have moral language which comes in declarative, truth-apt form? One of the things they will say is, well, doing that, having sentences like that is beneficial to everyone because it's good to be able to express the attitudes that are our moral thoughts. It's good to be able to express our attitudes about what to do, about how to think and feel, and to be able to argue and disagree and debate with each other. So we can understand why human beings would do this, why we would end up in a situation where attitudes get expressed in language which looks the same as ordinary descriptive language does. It's a kind of functional story. But Price thinks if that works, which remember, the moral expressivist is committed to thinking it does, because that's part of their theory, then it's going to easily carry over to what we might have thought were genuine representational non-expressivist cases. So if this idea that we can explain moral language in terms of its function, its beneficial function of expressing attitudes, we're going to be able to do the same thing in other cases. Because these other cases are cases where, according to a local expressivist, belief is involved rather than attitude, given some way of contrasting those two things. So in these other cases, we've got beliefs which are going to be expressed by sentences. And Price thinks these cases are just going to be much easier to explain given an expressivist outlook. Roughly, the idea is this. Well, okay, we have a story about why being able to express our attitudes, like approval and disapproval, would be helpful. But surely it would be just as helpful, if not more helpful, to be able to do the same thing with beliefs about how the world is. And it would be useful to do that because it would allow us to agree, to disagree, to coordinate, to align our beliefs, to make sure that we all are able to access the right kind of information to get around the world. That seems very plausible. It's useful for human beings to be able to learn stuff from their fellow human beings. It's useful to be able to know that the cafe is shut or that there's a tiger heading our way. So Price says, isn't it plausible it's even more useful to be able to debate, express, disagree, coordinate our beliefs than it is to be able to do the same thing with attitudes? But if we agree with that, Price then says, well, we're just using the expressivists' explanation of moral language and we're applying it to an easier case. So if the explanation works in the moral case, it's just going to work in every other case too, because those cases are easier. So if it works in the hard moral case, it works in the easy other cases too. And this gives us a kind of proof of concept for an expressivist theory of any kind of language. It doesn't give us any detail whatsoever, but that's not the point here. The point is that there's a proof of concept for that. So I have two big worries about this argument. And the first is the relationship between explaining language and explaining thought. So roughly the idea is that Price has only got us about halfway towards a global expressivism here. What he's shown us is that the expressivist tends to adopt a kind of psychologistic, Pricean, Lockean, ideationalist, whatever you want to call it, theory of how sentences work. They function to express mental states, in this case, attitudes. So the expressivist explanation here is explaining the features of moral sentences ultimately in terms of the attitudes that they express. So it's explaining facts about language, at least partly in terms of interesting facts about mental states. And Price thinks that that kind of explanation is just going to generalize to other sentences, because if it's good to be able to express moral attitudes, it's also going to be good to be able to express beliefs and other things like that. Now, we might worry that that's not true, that we can't generalize that psychologistic theory everywhere, that maybe there are large swathes of language which aren't going to be accounted for in the same way. But even if we grant that it can, we still don't have global expressivism. Why? Well, all Price has done, if he's right so far, is show us that we can explain all sentences without appealing to representation and the like. But it hasn't shown us that we can explain all of the thoughts that get expressed without using representation and the like. So Price gets us to the claim that once we have mental states whose expression is beneficial, we'll get an easy story about why they're expressed. But he hasn't shown us that we can have a non-representational story about all of those thoughts. It leaves open that the thoughts that get expressed in some cases can only be explained using representational concepts. So just as a very, very simple and naive example, just consider the belief that grass is green. Price can say, well, once you have the belief that grass is green, once we've made sense of that, we can see why it would be good to express that, to be able to coordinate and align our attitudes. But what he hasn't shown us is that we can account for the thought that grass is green without understanding it as representing or describing or having tracking relations or picturing or whatever it might be. He's just completely silent on that. And most importantly, the internal argument as a whole is only going to actually go through if the very fact that moral expressivism succeeds guarantees that we can explain all kinds of thoughts without representation. Because remember, Price's argument is saying, if moral expressivism succeeds, then it generalizes. But the condition on that actually happening is that if moral expressivism succeeds, we can give a non-representational story of all kinds of thoughts, including paradigm beliefs, like beliefs that we would use ordinarily to contrast against moral attitudes. So many of you will probably be doubtful that that's possible, but I've got kind of two reasons to think that it is indeed doubtful, largely for the point of the argument that Price is offering us. So the first is just that whether we can do this or not is just not guaranteed by expressivism at all. Nothing in expressivism tells us that the fact that we can account for moral thoughts in terms of attitudes would also mean that we can account for belief that grass is green in terms of anything but representational states. Also, it's just extremely plausible that some accounts of some thoughts will appeal to things that local expressivists think are representational concepts, like tracking, or belief, or reference. So it's, to the extent that it's plausible for the local expressivist that the term tree can only be explained in terms of its tracking of trees, well, I don't see why they wouldn't apply that also to the concept of a tree, and therefore to something like the belief that there is a tree outside. If we need the notion of tracking as a relation between the word tree and trees, we're also going to need it as a relation between the concept tree and trees. So anything that the local expressivists wanted to say that seemed to undermine global expressivism about language is just going to appear again at the level of thought and concepts. So there is just absolutely no reason to believe that just because the expressivists' explanation of moral language will generalize, which is not even obviously true, but we're assuming it, it's even less obvious that their explanation of moral thought will generalize. That they can take their account of moral thoughts and use it to show how we could account for any old thought, any old belief, without appealing to concepts like representation. Now, the story isn't over because Price has an even more kind of general, quite abstract argument at this point to put us off thinking this, which is the idea that expressivists, local expressivists, would be missing something if they agreed with what I've said so far. So here's a quote from him to explain this idea. He says, if we were to go with what I've just been saying, he said, then the claim that the easy cases, like belief, like grass is green, and so on, are genuinely descriptive, that is, have some more substantial kind of semantic property, what I've been calling representational concepts or representational properties, that seems problematic in one of two ways. Either it's an idle cog, not needed to explain the relevant aspects of the use of the statements in question, or if it's associated with some characteristic of use that the merely quasi, whatever, kind of truth cannot emulate, then it shows that expressivism is a sleight of hand. It fails to deliver the goods just where it really matters. So Price has this dilemma here. Either appealing to representational concepts when explaining some kinds of thought and language isn't necessary after all, in which case, global expressivism, or actually it was necessary, which showed us that in our original moral case, we've missed something. We haven't explained something. And we're disregarding that first point, the first one of the dilemma here, because we're assuming that some representational concepts are going to be needed to explain some thoughts. That's where the local expressivist is holding their ground here. So they now have to deal with the second one of the dilemma, which is the idea that that means their original explanation of moral language of thought missed something. Is this right? And obviously I can argue no. So we're at an extremely abstract level of argument here, but I think we can just about get through it. So Price's argument in very, very abstract form goes like this. Well, suppose global expressivism really is false. Well, then there's some kind of language of thought, say scientific language of thought, or the language of middle-sized dry goods, or something like that, that has some feature F that we can only explain using representational concepts. That's what global expressivism's failure commits us to. Well, if that's true, then we also can't explain why moral language has that feature F without using representational concepts. And that means that moral expressivism fails. But since we're moral expressivists, that they're the target of this argument, they can't accept that moral expressivism fails. It's not within their theory to accept that. So they just have to agree that global expressivism must be true. Otherwise, they've missed something. Now, this is an extremely abstract formulation, as I said, but doing it this abstractly lets us see two very straightforward, invalid moves here. One is that just because we need to use representational concepts to explain why, say, scientific language has this feature, that we also need to use those concepts to explain why moral language has this feature. But that's just not true. In fact, that's baked into moral expressivism from the very beginning. How do we explain the fact that moral thought and language feels representational, feels objective? Well, what we don't do is explain that in the same way that we explain why color talk or like the talk of middle-sized dry goods feels representational and descriptive. That's the whole point of expressivism, is to find a different way of explaining why moral thought and language has that kind of representational phenomenology to it, without actually saying that it is representing. So the fact that we might need representation to explain why chair and table talk feels representational doesn't mean that we need those concepts to explain why moral talk and thought feels representational. So that's an illegitimate move. Second, even if we can only explain these special features of scientific language, or whatever it is, the special feature F that we're talking about in the argument, even if we can only explain why scientific language has F in terms of representational concepts, doesn't even entail that moral language and thought has this magic feature, this special feature. So my example here would be direction of fit. We might say, you can't explain the world to mind direction of fit of moral language unless you appeal to representational concepts, because that's how we explain it in the case of scientific language. Well, the expressivists might just say, well, moral language doesn't have that direction of fit at all. So yeah, I agree. If it did, we'd have to use representation to explain it. But it doesn't, so we're fine. So there's no reason to think that the commitment to local expressivism commits the moral expressivist to thinking they missed something. They can say, I can explain everything I need to explain in the moral case. That doesn't mean that that will transfer neatly over to every other case. Maybe sometimes I will need to use concepts that are representational. Okay, so there is another escape route for Price here, which mirrors the one he used before. Just to say, well, we're using the wrong view of representational concepts. So once again, we appeal to things like tracking in some of my arguments. But actually, there is a quicker and neater argument for global expressivism here, which Price hasn't actually defended himself, but is right there for the taking. Here's the argument. If moral expressivism is right, then there's a set of predicates, moral ones, which can be explained without representational concepts. And that immediately entails that there is no one-size-fits-all concept that is going to explain all predicates. Because if there were, it would explain moral predicates. So moral predicates, according to the expressivist, just are a counterexample to the idea that there is one concept or a bunch of concepts which between them can explain a whole collection of terms like predicates, for example. But saying that is just what Price thinks global expressivism is, if we take this generality conception of representational concepts. If all it is to be a global expressivist is to say there's nothing that explains all predicates or all singular terms. If that's what global expressivism is, then local expressivists are committed to that. Moral expressivists are committed to that because they think that moral predicates are a counterexample. So just the success of moral expressivism immediately guarantees global expressivism according to this conception. But local expressivists don't accept this conception of global expressivism. So they're just not going to be interested by this point. This is a very easy victory for Price because it's not a real victory for Price at all. Okay, so we've got very good reason, looking at the details, to worry that Price's arguments just aren't going to succeed. And while there are some nice escape routes for him, they are just not going to help him actually target real life localists like Blackburn. So where next? Well, one conclusion I think we can draw from this is that seeing how Price considers representational concepts is actually quite revealing here, because it shows us that really him and Blackburn and co aren't really debating about anything substantial. So the idea is that actually Price put so much weight on his writings, on this generality conception of representational concepts, and Blackburn and Gibbard put so little weight on it that actually they're just talking about different things. When Blackburn says, I'm not a global expressivist, he means sometimes I mean things like tracking. When Price says, I am a global expressivist, he means we never need things that are super general. When he says, I'm not a local expressivist, he means we don't need things that are super general. So there's no real debate here. And we can see that both from the kind of very high level, looking at what we're saying about representational concepts, but also looking at the details on the arguments that Price gives. Now, Price, in a very characteristically Pricean fashion, has argued that this actually plays to his advantage because it shows that there is no coherent notion of local expressivism that's stable, that actually the local expressivist is kind of living a lie because they're saying things like, well, some terms are representational and some aren't, but that isn't really something that they can say because really they're agreeing with the globalist. But I just think that's false. Like, global expressivists and local expressivists are on equal footing here in the debate. It also reveals that Price's internal argument is actually just completely unnecessary. The whole shebang about expressing attitudes and the beneficial nature of that, and why we would do them, how it passes over to beliefs, that just doesn't matter anymore. Because the real internal argument for Price is that moral expressivism immediately entails global expressivism, given this conception of what these representational concepts actually are. It just goes through so quickly that you don't need any of that stuff that we've just talked about how the expressivist explanation works, how it's kind of generalized. You just don't even need that. So that suggests that Price didn't really have this in mind originally. And just finally, I think one thing that is interesting as an upshot here is that since local expressivists often do articulate their view as if our kind of standard approach to meaning, that is the one that expressivists tend to think they've learned to move away from, is actually a valid one for some areas of language and thought, and might even be the default. That might be something that we think the local expressivists should do without. Like, if you're a local expressivist and, for example, you're a minimalist about the notion of belief, then you shouldn't generally rely on there being a nice category of beliefs that you can say are kind of easy to explain. But it doesn't mean that when you actually look at that, that you're going to be some kind of global expressivist in a way that involves a genuine move away from the things that you always believed in. That's not because global expressivism, as defended by Price, isn't true, because as defended by Price, global expressivism is completely compatible with the localists' local expressivism. So I suppose like characteristically British ending to this, which is nobody wins this debate, but also nobody loses. So yeah, thank you very much.